Welcome to episode 18 of Radio Omnicor. I'm your host, Colleen McClintock, and you're listening to the show that is guaranteed to teach you something useful and introduce you to an interesting and dynamic guest. Today we have a slightly different setup. Dr. Hilton Rudnick is making way for our all-woman lineup, and that is Dr. Anne Carvalho and Addie Pillay. Anne is a counselling psychologist who has completed her doctorate in Women in Leadership. She's very knowledgeable and passionate about gender diversity in the workplace. Addie has attended the Omnicor Women in Leadership program and now works for Schneider Electric in the HR area. She is passionate about redress and empowerment for all minority groups and is working hard together with her L&D team to empower women. So welcome, ladies, to the studio. I'm so excited to host both of you. And the special episode for Women's Day coming up. And Anne, maybe you want to just start off by introducing yourself and why you're interested in this topic.
So thank you so much, Colleen, for inviting me to this very special broadcast, especially for August, taking into account Women's Month is upon us. And off the back of total shutdown March yesterday.
Yes.
For violence against women and just how prolific it's actually becoming. So women in leadership is very much a subject close to my heart. I think that we're far from where we need to be. So it's been a key interest, one of my niches for the last 20 years of how do we actually grow more women into senior leadership positions. It isn't enough to have people in junior leadership positions. So it's very much a subject close to my heart.
And also your doctorate that you worked on that specific subject.
Yes. So, my doctorate was around how do women themselves conceive leadership? How do they perceive leadership to be as a growth part? How do they internalize the construct leadership? And it was very interesting to see the results, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later.
Definitely. Great. And Addie, how did we manage to persuade you to come and join us in the studio today?
Well, thank you, Colleen, for inviting me, and to Anne as well. I actually was introduced to this amazing company called Omnicor.
Yes.
A good few years ago, and it was about women in leadership, and it was centered around developing women, and that introduced me to a lot of a different world altogether, because I found that yes, there were women in the workplace, but we didn't have a voice. And being exposed to these blind spots enabled me to actually see the working world quite differently. And so when this opportunity arose, I was for away and grabbed this. I think it's such an important role that we play as women.
And currently where you're working, I think you're quite pivotal around driving this empowerment for women and looking at potential ways your organization can do that.
Yes, that is correct. I'm currently at Schneider Electric for Southern Africa and responsible for payroll for RSA, Nigeria and Kenya. Mm-hmm. And so that's the Anglophone region. But not just that, being a part of a global pool allows me to tap in to the resources that we have and also get our message of diversity and inclusion and the role as women we can play.
And Addie, I saw, just in your introduction that you sent me, the sentiment around, for you, diversity isn't just around including people, it's around understanding and embracing cultures. And can you tell me a little bit more about why that's so important for you?
It is important for me, Colleen, because if you're looking at a global company and what we're wanting to do when we tap into that, if you're looking at an ocean is just not filled with dolphins and whales. It's filled with so many things, and there's got so many levels. So in global organizations, the one thing that we, when we're looking at diversity and inclusion, we think of it as just men and women. We're different. It goes beyond that. How do we speak? What is our body language? When I look at you, when I don't look at you, your accents, how does it translate? So for us, our headquarters is French. So it's you're looking at English versus French versus everything. We're looking at our languages here. All these are barriers to communication. And one thing, yes, we want to get our women out there. Yes, we want to be able to break these boundaries, but we need to understand what are our boundaries and how can we actually reach out and bridge that gap. And that is why these cultural differences and understanding that and the communication around that and how we communicate to one another is so important.
And it's so complex.
Very complex. It's just a whole, if you just picture a web, but the moment a spider actually starts to move in that, or let's put it this way, how does a spider actually catch its prey? The moment an insect actually starts to walk on that spider feels that web moving. And that's exactly like with when we reach out. What we've started here and the vision and the purpose and the drive that Omnicor is doing is much greater than just let's introduce and grow women into leadership. It goes beyond that. It goes to, we've started something. That web has started to move. And that is, what is our voice? The thesis, the doctorate that you did, Anne, speaks about that. It speaks about where do we want to take women. And it's not all about seriousness.
Right.
It's a lot of fun. We're fabulous people.
Exactly.
And we're a people. And that is amazing. And we take such richness and uniqueness into any organization, places, into the world in general, what women are doing, the roles that we play in our communities. All of these things are vitally important on how we are influencing each other, our cultures, our society, and of course the world.
So, and our families. I think that's such a difficult tension between.
Absolutely.
So, Anne, looking at some recent statistics that Grant Thornton released, they said that the percentage of women in senior management positions in South Africa has risen from 26% to 29%, and that's in the last 4 years, which is pretty dismal. What is the science behind why we need to drive this?
So if I may just add to those stats that they released, if you unpack those stats even further and you look at the various layers and you start interrogating what do they mean by senior leadership, it's actually more horrifying than that. So when they talk 29%, they're aggregating your CEO levels with the level directly under CEOs and possibly even the third layer underneath that. If you're talking senior leadership, so women on the board, CEOs, COOs, you're looking at about 4%, and that's a global figure. And that global figure hasn't shifted very much in the last couple of years. And that's really concerning, because if you think of how far women have come over the last century, we're still nowhere near where we should be if you consider our proportion as a population.
Which is
in the
50%?
Which is, let's just go with 50%.
Yeah.
It's slightly more. In South Africa, I think it was 51% last time I looked. So if we're 51% of the population, how come we're not 51% of the board? So those stats, when you look at lower down levels, when you start looking at junior management, perhaps team leaders and supervisors, there's more equity involved. The essence, the nub of this is that we need more women and we need equity at senior levels, because that is where policy is influenced. So the greater amount of women that we have at board level, the greater impact it has on policy. So, for example, maternity policies. So where it's important, if you take into account maternity policies, just to name but one that absolutely impacts the females rather than males. If a woman is going on maternity leave and she returns back to the organization and there's a performance review period, what I picked up from my research based on the organization, it is a bank, that in that performance review, that particular mother now comes back and is offered an average rate. So that average rating has long-term implications for her, because then it impacts her salary and it impacts her promotional ability, where she actually isn't assessed according to her level that she was at before going on maternity leave. So she gets put back as a result of those maternity policies. So if you have more women at board level, you have a greater influence as to how these policies can then be impacted and not be skewed in the favor of men. Hence the reason why I say it is critically important that we have a greater equity at senior level.
Right. What are the other benefits for organizations to have more women working for them at senior levels?
So all research that has had a look at where there's more diverse boards and where there's more diverse an executive that takes into account, as Addie, as you said, more cultures, more gender diversity, is that there's greater profits. There is greater ethics at play here. There's greater governance at play. Greater oversight of the organization rather than it's skewed to one particular worldview. So it has a direct impact on organizational profits.
So the diversity of worldview, as Addie was speaking about earlier, is actually critical for the commercial success of the organization.
That is exactly what there was a study done in the UK where they had a look at where boards with greater diversity versus the profits versus good governance versus where there was less so, and in terms of ethics involved and corporate greed, if you want to call it that. What was the variation between these? And certainly the impact has shown, or their research has actually shown, that where there is greater diversity, there's better governance, corporate governance, because there's a greater diversity. It's almost that we bring a different outlook to what is actually important to the bottom line, what is important to the organization, how do we get people's buy-in into that organization.
So a lot of skeptics would say, well, the women in leadership programs are not enough. Maybe they're not skeptics, maybe they're realists. What more needs to be happening in organizations? Because we walk around these organizations and we see stuff in 2018 and we hear stories that are happening in 2018 that you would imagine come from, a century ago. So what else needs to be happening in companies?
Absolutely correct. I mean, I'm the front runner, flag bearer for running women in leadership development programs in organizations, but it isn't sufficient, because in some cases it could be just a tick box exercise. Well, you've given you this particular program, now go and implement, and we've assisted you so far. Hence the reason why I say policy does actually need to be looked at. In addition to that, we're not in this journey on our own. We do need to bring the rest of the population on board. And what I mean by that is we need to look at biases. What are those implicit and hidden biases that are in organizations that we ourselves contribute to? So it's in the language that we use when we start thinking about how do we describe men, for example. How do men describe women leaders? So it is as subtle as looking at a woman saying, well, she was very caring, she was building relationships with her staff, as opposed to a male leader who, well, he achieved targets, and you start looking at the task focus. And to an element is that, or to your point, Colleen, when you're talking about we've moved on and, this was 100 years ago, but part of it still carries on, think leader, think male. So a lot of work still needs to be done around how do we view the word leadership and in the words that we actually use, and that we are not punishing a certain gender because that's our viewpoint.
Eddie, what do you feel about?
I do agree with Anne, absolutely. If you're looking at what you've just noted earlier with regards to maternity leave, for example, and driving policies and processes. So when you're having women that are at that level writing these policies and influencing that, we're looking at it globally, we're influencing a global community. We're looking at bringing in your work-life balance. Work-life balance, I think, is a little bit of, it's not just tipping the scale, but more holistically, because now when we're bringing in flexibility as well, our younger generation and how they're viewing things, there isn't a 24-hour as we would see it as an 8 to 5. Mm-hmm. It is a whole variance of that. So when we're talking about work-life balance, we're talking about something that's completely different. Now it takes maternity leave to a whole new level because we're working from home. Our office isn't just a place where we're getting into the car and driving through to now. Our office becomes our homebound things. Mm-hmm. So what does it entail? It drives in there, brings in a greater aspect to this, and financially uplifting, because now it saves on so much of things, as in costs, but it also uplifts you and builds you, and you can spend more time developing your children. The unconscious bias that you speak of, it's exactly something where I said the blind spot that I had before I was introduced to women in leadership, because of the different facets and pillars that you actually introduced, unconscious bias being one of them. There was a lovely exercise that one of the psychologists that came through did, and that was with basketball, and here, watch the screen very carefully, and there was something that was going across the screen, to which I was one of those people that didn't see, because I was so focused on counting the ball that he said, how many times did the person bounce the ball? And to realize these blind spots that one actually has, you then take it into the organization, and you start to actually see, what are my unconscious blind spots? Because also, us as women, we would walk into a room and a man and a woman walks in. So the message that the man gives, or the message that the woman will come in and give to us, we'll acknowledge you, perhaps. But if the man walks into the room with the same message, we're acting on it. How often do we actually do that? Do we note this about ourselves? So this is what happens when you talk about unconscious bias, as an example. So it's something that we need to be made aware of. 100 years ago, the behavior you talk of, Colleen, is something that if we're looking at where we are and in the studies that you have done, yes, we have progressed, but the change has only recently started to happen. Back as in our 50s and our 60s, women are still finding their voices. They were a bit more vocal, but it's only just recently that we've started to make this shift into our working environment. So I would be very interested to see, especially when you're talking about those stats, are we equipping our women as they are moving in the chain to where they actually need to be? And when I say equipping, have we given them the tools to identify what they need to about themselves to implement in the workforce?
And when we're looking at equipping the woman, are we looking at the organization as a whole and saying, this is actually what we need to change? Exactly. And what we need to change is bring into the conversation those unconscious bias that you're talking about. Let's acknowledge them. Let's talk about those remarks that get passed in the corridor about... could be sexist comments. How does that impact? How do we react? How do men become more aware of that particular language? To back up in terms of research, with research, when we're talking about biases, Harvard conducted a really stunning exercise with professors, so people who'd reach an academic level, and it was both male and female. They were presented with CVs of a particular person who was applying for a lab assistant position in the STEM area, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics area. So they were given a CV that either was James or they were given a CV as Jennifer. And what was so interesting to see was the distinction between how much pay would be given to James as opposed to how much pay would be given to Jennifer. And one level is the difference between how would the female professors have rated and how would the male professors, and there was no difference between the two. In other words, where are we, even as women, actually being biased against our own? So how do we it's so complex, this. How do we begin to unpack this? Not just in terms of male biases, but women against not supporting. So that sisterhood, which I think men have downpacked. The old boys club, everybody knows about that. But how do we go about creating that sisterhood, and how do we communicate the importance of having that sisterhood that assists us to amplify each other's point of view. So there's a lovely example as well with Obama's presidency. And Obama was far more perhaps mindful in terms of diversity and awareness in terms of gender parity, and where the women in these executive meetings had taken upon themselves how to amplify each other's points and bringing their own policies to the table so as to raise it to the level of where they wanted it to be.
The thing you've spoken now about how women sometimes don't support each other, and there's this competition that goes on seemingly invisibly. It's quite disturbing, because you're saying not only do we fight the biases, but we're not supporting. So how could women support each other more in organizations?
Well, building that sisterhood, as I've begun to explain. How do we sit down with one another and say we're not actually in competition with one another, we're here to support each other, because if one of us grows, then we can all grow. So it's about creating that pipeline that says that if we've got more women in senior leadership and we're supporting those women in senior leadership, we ourselves can become role models for the generation to follow, building our own old boys club, if you want, just a sisterhood of support. So very much what Cheryl was actually talking about leaning in and creating that dynamic. How do we share our experiences with one another? How do we tell our stories? And that is really effective. So we've seen certainly in our Women in Leadership programs, when we bring a senior leader in to have a discussion and share her story of how she's actually reached the executive level, the response that we've had from the delegates in that particular group, that has built them hope, that has given them a different way of looking at that this is possible.
So more on the women in leadership and the discussion around why do we need a women in leadership program specifically for women, because some people could argue that's really patronizing. Women are not, what are you shame? You need to give them a class. And why are men not involved in those sessions? Because if we really want to change, sometimes it's the men that need to be taught, not the women.
And Colleen, I feel very similar in terms of the almost the critical view of it. Is I would like to see the day that we don't need to be running women in leadership programs, because it means that we've actually grown to the point where we don't need to have this discussion. We're leaders, irrespective of who you are. And I certainly think from the viewpoint, again, backed up by research, is why do we take women only and put them through a leadership program, is about finding your voice. And what we're looking at by comparison is when you think of a normal meeting, what happens in normal meetings when you've got very strong, powerful male voices, what does that do to women's voices? Whereas when we take in a group of women, we're giving them a space to talk about things and a confidential space and a non-judgmental space that says you can use your voice and this is how you can use your voice. So it grows that level of confidence when they hear themselves speak and when they're taken seriously. But I also think that there must be a space for men to enter into that program so that they too can be part of the development. Because in real life, it's not just a woman-only meeting or a woman-only board meeting. So we do need to bring that the male view of this is how we're going to interact, and perhaps to grow men's appreciation and awareness of biases, of what do you do if you come in and you're very arrogant and you're very loud. What does it do to me? What does it do to my voice? What happens when I put a point across and I'm ignored, but a male counterpart talks about exactly the same point and that is taken further? So these are key issues that we need to build in to women in leadership development programs.
And Addie, in environments where jobs are typically done by men, I think it's something that you experience. It's even harder because women sometimes are not given the credibility that they can get, even although they have maybe a degree in engineering. There's a sense that because of their gender, they're not going to. Is that something that would need to be addressed?
Yes, and I believe that it is being addressed, and therefore programs such as this encourages the women that are going into these fields and giving them the tools to actually voice and say, I am good enough. I can do this. Because coming back to Anne, what you actually said earlier on, it is it's not just the women in leadership. I know we're going to do away with that. But right now, because it's still so fresh, we are looking at an environment where it's the hunter-gatherer sort of still mentality. The men should go out there, hunt for the food, and the women should just be gathering and playing nice at home, but still bring in the meat as well. So we're building an educational system. We're being mothers. We're also out there working. You see, that dynamic hasn't really shifted. What's actually happened is that the role of women has expanded. So we're not just sitting at home. We are now out there. We've become career-driven. And where the advantages come through is that the men have had a head start, if I can put it that way, in a race. They've had a head start. So they're halfway through the marathon. And we've just begun. So that's where it is, and that is why these programs are so vitally important. It's not because we don't know what we're doing, that the degrees that we have and the doctorates that we've got aren't hard-earned, but we deserve to be there. And in getting there, we should be educated, and these tools educate us into using it, into how do we implement it. Okay, so I've got a knife and fork in front of me. I don't know this. What do I do? Do I pick it up? Do I kick it around? And that's what the Women in Leadership program actually does. It says, here's the knife and fork. This is how you're going to hold it, and this is how you're going to use it in the organization and in the world where you're going out there. It's okay to question. That's what I learned. Anne used to come in there and she used to have, okay, if you can see me, my hand is going onto the other hand, where she would say, come on, we can do this. Yes. That sisterhood you speak of is encouraging. It uplifts us as women. We tell our stories. Storytelling is so important because it shares and it brings in a commonality that we realize that, hey, Anne, Colleen, we're not that different. You've also been through such challenges. Wow, and you still wear it with such grace. And you studied till what time? Oh no, but she did it. She survived. And X, Y, and Z has actually happened. How much of times do you have single parents, both men and women, that share their journeys, and they've been there through what adversity it is. But we often assume just because Mary is driving that Porsche, she's from a wealthy family and it just landed on her lap. But when you tell the stories, you unbundle all of that. And you realize that we've all had a journey, and that's what's so important. The Women in Leadership also brought in that we need buy-in from men. We're not doing this alone. This is a journey where we are inclusive, gender inclusive. So even when we're doing at Schneider next week, we're celebrating our women, yay, and we've got our men in there. It's open to everybody. Come, celebrate. And that's what we want. We want our sons, we want our daughters, we want our husbands, our friends, our partners to celebrate who we are dynamically as us. And say we celebrate the fact that we are finding our voices, that we are standing up. We're standing up to a great number of issues, and that we understand who we are and our strengths. So eventually, Anne, I think your dream will be fulfilled, and we will get to a point where we actually don't need to do this. We actually are finding other ways to uplift and use these tools to grow. But now it's about when that young woman stands up and says, no, it's not be quiet, it's not your place. It's good. When a young woman stands up and questions, you have every right to question it. It's our reconditioning as parents that teach that our children have voices and you should be and will be heard.
My teenage daughters will really enjoy that.
If I may add to that,
yes.
When you're talking about the fields that are traditionally male fields, and similar to my take on, it would be nice to have the day where we're not having Women in Leadership program, we're having a leadership program. If you look, for example, the aviation field, so I read with both joy and sorrow things like in India, it was celebrated that there was a first ever flight where it was only women who were involved, from the cockpit to the rest of the crew to the handlers, ground staff, the engineers and controllers, air controllers. Now I really had to think about that. I had to think about, why do we need to celebrate that in 2017? That it was an all-woman crew, and yes, we do need to acknowledge that. But isn't there also a point where, it's two women in the cockpit, and we're going to get there anyway, as opposed to us having to highlight that this is something that's been achieved. The airline, same thing. It was also made headline news for the first time. It wasn't even by design. It was just due to circumstances. We had a co-pilot and a pilot who were both female, but it makes news. Where was the last time where you had two male co-pilots that made news?
But I think that is exciting, though. I think it does show that stuff is changing. And I think going back to the conversation we were having earlier around the sisterhood, one of the things that comes up often is women struggle to play what we would call corporate politics. Don't want to play the game. I'm not going to get involved. And I don't know if your doctorate spoke to any of that stakeholder management and how women struggle, with the game playing that goes on in organizations. Is that something that women struggle with generally?
Very much so. One of my phases of the research was to have a look at this idea of what do women see is required to reach senior leadership. So there was an exercise that my participants needed to take part in order to assess what were the factors that they saw needed leadership to grow, but senior leadership, male or female, so there wasn't a specific. And what was interesting was at the end of the exercise to hear the reflections of the participants. And invariably, there was a talk around, I didn't network enough. I didn't speak to the right people enough. I wasn't part of the decision maker. So there was an awareness that the people who made it, and generally in this case they were talking about perhaps a male executive that had become a CEO or a COO, had networked with the correct people. They had golfed, they had gone running with a particular important decision maker, and whereas they did their job. So there was a distinct difference between how they actually saw their day at work versus these leaders who had made it. What was the distinction between the two? So there is an idea about, in this particular organization, is I'm going to come to work and I'm going to do this job to the best ability that I can do. And not really growing, looking to the future to say, I want to become an executive, but what do I need to do now to become the executive? And playing the corporate politics and doing the networking isn't part of it. But there's also a practical implication to that, because women have another job. So in order to do the networking, in order to play those corporate politics, there's additional hours that's required. So they're also at a slight disadvantage when it comes to being able to be involved in such extra activities at the organization, whereas men are far freer because they have somebody at home to take care of the family, the home environment.
And I think that whole tension between being a present mother and working is real. I've experienced it. You've experienced it, and you, Anne. So how do we as women take what you've learned from the doctorate? What are the tips in terms of networking and seeing it as vital?
It's very interesting because, as you say, and that it brings to mind again the woman that I'd interviewed, and it comes down to sisterhood. So in one of my interviews, one of the senior women was talking about how important it was to assist her own staff who needed to be part of a networking event where they offered to look after their children, that particular individual's children. So there are ways to come around this in order to be present at those functions that they need to be present at. And in the book Lean In, it's also the point is made where make your partner a real partner. So being able to negotiate, this is what's important for my career, this is where I need to be, this is now your turn. Who does the cooking? Who looks after the children at the time that I need? So it's about speaking up and saying, actually, I have a different role to play as well, and having the courage to do that.
I think it was at one of our sessions, Marcel actually brought up and yourself, we were having that particular lesson. And it was around how women, we tend to complicate things a little bit. I find that hard to believe. But it is in that networking. Before I pick up the phone to Colleen, I'm going to have to think, okay, do I have to make, a small conversation? Do I have to ask about the family? Do I have to ask this? Do I have to now give a favor? Men, on the other hand, will pick up the phone and say, hi, Colleen, listen, I need a favor. Can we do this? And it's done. There's no hidden agendas. There's no, I'm going to think, oh, do I owe Colleen now? Do I have to go out and buy a coffee and lunch? And I don't have the time. This is, can you see already? I've exhausted myself, and at the end of the day, I haven't picked up the phone to phone Colleen to ask her a simple question. And guess what? I've already decided for Colleen. So this is something where we actually complicate things. Very nice, where we talked about branding and networking, and I happened to win the CD for the networking.
That's true.
And my LinkedIn profile went from 50 people, now it's sitting at about 1,500. So awesome, because when you actually get to pick up the phone and say, okay, Colleen, the time is right, it will happen. So can I need to go from X to Z? Sure. Just yesterday, a colleague of mine, there was a project that needed to be launched. I just finished one project and I spoke to a key individual. I'll hook you up. Do you see, it's just a simple conversation, and often that is what networking is all about. It goes just simply beyond, I'm going to need to go and spend 5 hours after work, I'm going to have to do this. Networking isn't necessarily a hindrance, and I made that big mistake until I was educated to say it's about simplifying it. The moment I see something else, I think it's more work. It's just automatic. How often do we think, do I now need to really speak to Peter to get this done?
Not Peter.
Oh, not Peter. Not Peter again. Oh, man. But, this is it. But it's important. And then also in sales, when you're talking about those drinks, those long hours, do we have to? I think women here bring such a uniqueness in, because earlier on I was just in a conversation exactly on that very matter. And I said, how do we coach? How do we coach the woman? She brings in a uniqueness here to do something differently. Why do we need to drink to close that deal? Do we?
I'm listening to you, Addie, and I'm wondering, is it right that we attribute women to being complicators? Because that's a bit of a gender stereotype in a way. I think is it not more the lack of confidence, perhaps, that keeps us... maybe that's also a false attribution, Dr. Anne. But I think we do fall into the trap of attributing gender to things that are not really a gender thing.
So Colleen, the attribution of certain traits to certain genders is a real thing. So when we think about women, and again, a very well-researched topic is we are relationship builders, we are the carers, we are the nurturers. And when people think about the men, they are the task orientators, they are the ones orientated, they are the ones that are going to take charge. And it spoke directly to my results of my PhD, where in the final model that I built, the message in this particular organization was men take charge and women take care.
Wow.
And it was so interesting to see it manifest in interviews and aha moments where senior women became aware that where the decisions were made, where the project was handed to, and where now, as female executives, they were now required to take care of that particular decision. And one way to have a look at, does this hold true? Look to see what positions women hold in EXCO. Who is the HR executive? Who is the COO? Who is the head of IT? And then you begin to unpack that. So for ourselves and for our listeners, engage with this. Start interrogating this from just a simple construct point of view.
I'm not sure you answered my question.
Sorry.
But it was very interesting. But I do think we need to be careful to make sort of generalized attributions. Yeah, women are X, Y, and Z, but that's the sensitivity around how do we engage in the organizations. And as you said, Addie, earlier, we've all got our own biases. They're subconscious. They sit with us. Now, I want to raise, it's quite a new thing. I don't know if you've heard about this and what you think about it, which is parents who are now raising their children gender neutral. Have you heard about this?
Yes.
So we're going to leave it up to you. We're not going to give you any clues at all regarding the color that we dress, your little outfits. We're going to give you pronouns that don't lead you in any way to your gender. And I was just wondering, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've seen it a lot, especially in Twitter. There's a lot going on about this. And I see it's driven by celebs, I think. I see that coming through quite extensively about how they're not going to raise their child in a particular gender, how celebs are allowing their older children, to males, to dress in dresses, to girls to be more male. I think it's early days. I think it's such a new thing. I don't have any research to back that up, so I'm keen to see the results of this.
Just the psychology and the development, and how does that impact?
Yes, and how ready is that particular person's community when they go to school, when they're socializing with their friends, when they're out with the family. What is going to be that impact?
Especially since there's such a low percentage of people who are confused about gender or not 100% sure. But it's a whole new world, Addie, that we live in. And you've said that we're catching up to speed. And I think given the whole coming out with women who are standing up and, the Me Too and all of this stuff, it's quite alarming what women have been through to just get jobs, especially in Hollywood and in corporates and these big networks.
Colleen, I completely agree on that. And just listening to Anne, I mean, it's early days. And it's going to be very interesting with the psychology of things, because we need an identity. We need to identify. I mean, that is why there's such an advancedness. We either Christian or we Jewish or so as we're growing up, we are needing to identify to something. It is innately in us. So now, when you are neither here nor there, it's going to be very interesting to see how this is going to unfold and develop. Because we grew as a society just to identify and speak our voices. I mean, now we're going to go into something else. Here I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm, heterosexual, asexual, transgender, all of these things, and you're finding your place. Now you're going, I'm nothing really. I am. That's exactly it. I'm neither male nor female. You have to. Well, not have to, but yes, for me personally, you have to identify to something, a sense of belonging. Now we're just trying to find ourselves, our voices, so it's going to be extremely interesting to see. And only if I wish I had a little glass that I could see at least 15 years into the future and what's actually happened.
Well, some might argue that so far it hasn't worked so well for us, being so stuck on our identity and our gender. Then we have to untease it and have women in leadership programs, and even in the history of South Africa. Being a minority and having to deal with all of the judgment and the bias and the discrimination. Maybe it's something that would work.
But it's a scary world. As simple as going to the loo could be a problem.
Exactly. And with all sorts of implications.
Yeah, our kids, no. But interesting times.
So as we wrap up, and what from your doctorate, what would you say as women are the key takeaways for you from that research?
So it's a very good question, because we're looking at where can we empower ourselves is actually what I think you're asking. How can we grow our own leadership where we're not reliant on external programs? And critical to our growth is about finding our voices and being confident in our voices, owning our successes, which I find we don't do enough. We don't stand in our own successes. Your achievement. I'm an engineer. I'm a pilot. I am all of these things, plus I am a mother, rather than second guessing ourselves about, do Do I have enough degrees? Do I know enough? So for me, it's critical about speaking up, putting your hand up, building a very strong, incredible, reliable brand in an organization, that you are known in the organization, that you are elevating your presence. Because when we think about my work must speak for myself, it doesn't work that way anymore. We do need to be more visible than what we are at the moment, and it is up to us. It's where we think, but I'm bragging, but you're not bragging, you're speaking up. For me, those are critical components.
And Addie, what thoughts are you left with in terms of advice for organizations and the idea of driving diversity?
Is embrace it. Embrace the change. Change is good. Moving up and onwards. Keeping abreast means that we change the way the river flows. And it's always a good thing.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful place to put a comma, could we say, in our podcast. It's been so stunning to chat to both of you, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Eddie.
Change in policy does not mean reform, and our current statistics are a call to action. We need more women in executive leadership, and this is backed by solid science, and businesses who ignore this do so at their own peril. Omnicor's Women in Leadership program, led by Dr. Anne Carvalho, is transformational for both individuals and organizations. Find out more about our program on our episode, and if you liked this episode, please subscribe and comment. You can check out more details on www.omnicor.co.za. And thank you so much to William Irwin, our producer.